Another video about Sonic CD? Yes, it is, because we have some unfinished business. Getting that video about Sonic CD's Japanese/European soundtrack done after so many years of hesitation took a massive weight off of my shoulders, and I'm really glad that it's gotten the positive reception that it has. So much so that I decided to ride the momentum and do something similar with Sonic CD's American soundtrack. After all, I did say that it was worth discussing for different reasons, and that I'd prefer to do so in a separate video. The fascinating thing about Sonic CD having two different soundtracks is that people tend to show a strong preference for the one they heard first, especially if it's the one they grew up listening to, which I'm a little guilty of myself. Because I experienced the Japanese/European soundtrack first, and exclusively for a while, I had long felt like the American soundtrack was a major downgrade, and I didn't really give it a chance until fairly recently, when I sat down and played through Sonic CD with the American soundtrack, and then it finally clicked with me. There's long been a noticeable divide between how Japan and the United States handled this franchise's characters and settings. Especially back in the 1990s, Sonic the Hedgehog media from Japan tended to keep things simple, not really emphasizing continuity as much as their American counterparts, which often featured more interconnected, more detailed, and more dramatic settings. As a good point of reference, look at how much the Western-made Sonic cartoons and comics tried to flesh out Mobius as a centralized locale, when the video games, by contrast, were only loosely connected. And even through something as relatively straightforward as a different soundtrack, Sonic CD managed to become part of this phenomenon as well. The moment that observation came to mind was the moment that I believe I had figured out the appeal of Sonic CD's American soundtrack, and why people who prefer it might feel inclined to call it the better of the two. Now, is it my favorite? No. But I have a much greater sense of appreciation for it now than I used to. And since I already tackled the Japanese/European soundtrack, I think it's only fair that I give the American soundtrack its appropriate time in the spotlight too. My name is Sherry, and I'll be your designated Talekeeper today, as we take a listen to the other side of Sonic the Hedgehog CD, going into the American soundtrack and talking about what makes it so effective and memorable in its own right. I've done my best to get acquainted with this one, and there's quite a bit of interesting info to get into, so let's jump right in. When it comes to talking about the American soundtrack of Sonic CD, there's no better place to start than by explaining why there are two different soundtracks in the first place, as well as introducing the artists who were in charge of putting the new music together. The Japanese and European releases of Sonic CD both featured the original soundtrack by Naofumi Hataya and Masafumi Ogata, but in the land between Europe and Japan, Sega of America had some reservations about that techno and house-heavy club music sound. To them, that was something trendy that numerous other games were already trying to do. Thus, they believed that Sonic CD would perform better on the market if it did something to stand out from the crowd. It was also a good opportunity to show off Sega's overseas talent. But replacing the soundtrack, especially for a Sonic game, was a big risk. So Sega of America made sure to appoint the right talent for the job, and that was the duo of Spencer Nilsen and David Young. Now, Sonic CD is, without a doubt, the most popular soundtrack that both Nilsen and Young worked on, but I want to take a moment to acknowledge their prior work with Sega, both because it's important for understanding Sonic CD's American soundtrack, and also because I don't want to relegate their talents to just one game. Between the two, David Young had the smaller list of credits when Sonic CD was released in North America. At that point in time, only one other game directly credited him, and that was the Sega CD version of Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin, which was released earlier in 1993 and, funnily enough, also involved David Young working with Spencer Nilsen. But even though that's just a one-game sample size, you can immediately hear a similar synth rock influence that would define much of Sonic CD's American soundtrack. Spencer Nilsen, meanwhile, had a handful of credits for working on the music in games like Batman Returns, Joe Montana's NFL Football, Echo the Dolphin, and the aforementioned Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin, all of which were on the Sega CD. Of these, I want to focus on Echo the Dolphin first and foremost, because it's defined by a particular hallmark of Nilsen's compositional style, and one that fits the other major descriptor for Sonic CD's American soundtrack: ambient music, or atmospheric music, as it's also known. When Spencer Nilsen was brought on board to handle the Red Book audio soundtrack for Echo the Dolphin, he was specifically asked to create a soundtrack that was far removed from being human-sounding, and instead matched the underwater oceanic setting. The result, which involved using at least 30 different synthesizers and a select handful of live instruments, was musically deep and immersive, beautiful and calming at some points, but dramatic and foreboding at others. It helped show what kinds of incredible new textures and moods CD audio could bring to video games, and the similarities to Sonic CD should be pretty easy to pick out. But that's not to say that Spencer Nilsen's other work at the time isn't worth mentioning. On the contrary, you can hear several of the same elements of synth rock and ambient music that I mentioned with Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin and Echo the Dolphin respectively. I just wanted to highlight those two specifically for being the clearest examples of the bunch. But these should sound pretty close to his work on Sonic CD as well. Although Sega of America wanted their version of Sonic CD to feature a different soundtrack, they still needed the game to be ready in time for the all-important holiday season, which gave Nilsen and Young just 7 weeks to have everything done. That's some pretty tremendous pressure, but as Spencer Nilsen has indicated, both he and Young actually welcomed the challenge. Using his connections in the local music scene of the San Francisco Bay Area, Nilsen was able to recruit additional talent to help get the soundtrack finished in time. This included keyboardist Mark Sterling Crew and percussionist Armando Peraza, both of whom were former members of Santana, as well as a local jazz trio named Pastiche, comprised of Sandy Cressman, Jenny Meltzer, and Becky West. Additional instrumentation was also provided by a group of associates familiar to both Nilsen and Young: drummer and percussionist Brad Kaiser, guitarist Eric Freichman, and bassist Bobby Vega. It was just enough talent to get everything done within the deadline, but the entire process had to move at an expedited pace. When it came to splitting up the workload, the bulk of Sonic CD's American soundtrack was to be co-composed by Spencer Nilsen and David Young, the latter of whom was also largely responsible for the production side of things, including instrument programming, sound mixing, and performing on the keyboards that were employed for the music. The new themes for Collision Chaos, Metallic Madness, and the game's boss battles, however, were all composed and arranged by Mark Sterling Crew. As for Pastiche, they would provide improvised harmonies that were then mixed into various parts of the soundtrack, as Nilsen liked the idea of accenting the music with female vocals, which he saw as a subtle way to remind players of Amy Rose, who made her first video game appearance in Sonic CD. And in case you hadn't noticed them before, here are a few examples. Then there was the matter of the game's vocal opening and ending themes. Instead of reusing Sonic You Can Do Anything and Cosmic Eternity Believe in Yourself from the original Japanese soundtrack, Sega of America wanted a theme song that was better suited for marketing the game in the United States. The result, co-created by Pastiche and Spencer Nilsen, was the now iconic Sonic Boom. In order to make it work with both animated sequences, the song was split into an opening version and an ending version with slightly different lyrics and instrumentation. And on that note, if I can just make a quick remark here, the ending version doesn't really get the same amount of attention. And that's absolutely criminal when it has such a smooth as silk transition from vocals to an acoustic guitar as it ends. The only thing that Nilsen and Young's team couldn't change were the past themes, because these weren't Red Book audio like the rest of the soundtrack. Instead, they were sequenced through the Ricoh RF5C164 PCM chip inside the Sega CD, as a way to conserve disk space without losing too much in the way of audio quality. Replacing any of these would have required reprogramming the instrument and notation data, and trying to do that 7 times within a 2-month deadline, while also replacing the rest of the music, was simply asking too much. Perhaps if there was additional time to work with, Nilsen and Young could have made it happen. But thankfully, in the years since Sonic CD's release, fans have made their own what-if renditions, and I'd love to highlight King Meteor Studios' work in particular. Even if these aren't actually sequenced through the Ricoh RF5C164, they still hit that wonderful sweet spot between keeping the dramatic tone of the American soundtrack at large, while also working in the more curious tone of the Japanese/European soundtrack's past themes. It takes serious talent to make something this official sounding, and I could easily imagine the real deal being a lot like these. Now, unlike Naofumi Hataya, who has gone on record confirming the primary influences that he and Masafumi Ogata used to create the original soundtrack, neither Spencer Nilsen, nor David Young, nor Mark Sterling Cruz seem to have made similar comments about their work on the American soundtrack. For the most part. But I don't think that's necessarily because of a lack of information. Rather, I believe it's simply a difference in methodology. Because Spencer Nilsen has at least indicated that his work on Sonic CD was inspired by the design and flow of the level with its music removed, not so much an overarching influence or set of influences. An ideal point of reference for this idea would be Stardust Speedway, whose present version in the American soundtrack conveys a strong feeling of motion, like driving through an empty highway late at night, which is kind of what Stardust Speedway is when you really think about it. Listening to the American version without gameplay paints the level in your head, with its vast starry skies, roads made of brass instruments, and even the general pace it all goes at. Speed ahead to the Good Future version, and the music puts greater emphasis on the twinkling synths and electric guitars, the latter of which includes a particularly triumphant-sounding riff that reflects the more optimistic appearance of the level, as well as the idea that Sonic is nearly done saving Little Planet from Dr. Robotnik. The blue blur is in the home stretch now, and he's gonna do his victory lap against Metal Sonic. Conversely, there's the Bad Future version, which is easily one of the best parts of the American soundtrack. With its more aggressive-sounding electric guitars and haunting vocals accenting the synths, it gives the race against Metal Sonic a unique sense of tension, and I really like that it got an official remix in Sonic Forces, after so many years of the Japanese version being used as Metal Sonic's de facto theme. Both are fantastic, but I imagine that the darker, more dramatic tone of Sonic CD's American soundtrack was the better fit there. As you could probably tell from my glowing commentary, Stardust Speedway is where I feel that Spencer Nilsen's creative vision and musical style shine through better than any other part of the American soundtrack, which I find especially funny, and maybe a little poetic, because I made the exact same comment about Naofumi Hataya's work when I was talking about the Japanese/European soundtrack. There's just something about this level that brings out the best of everyone, isn't there? In addition to confirming that his compositional process is rooted in visual impressions, Spencer Nilsen has also mentioned that he was able to listen to the original soundtrack by Naofumi Hataya and Masafumi Ogata during the early stages of replacing the music. And I bring this up because there happen to be a few spots in the American soundtrack that seem to overlap with the Japanese/European soundtrack, which makes me wonder if Nilsen and Young thought that some of it was worth keeping intact. To be more specific, I'm referring to 3 of the gang's 7 levels: Palm Tree Panic, Tidal Tempest, and Wacky Workbench. While the American version of Palm Tree Panic is missing that same central influence from early Euro House, it still uses the tonal flavors of African percussion and Latin brass to evoke a tropical feeling. Sure, it sounds like stereotypical safari music by comparison, and the Bad Future lacks the same tonal gut punch as the Japanese version, but I still like it. It feels right at home as first-level Sonic music, especially alongside Angel Island Zone from Sonic 3. With Tidal Tempest, the American version of its present theme goes at a similar pace to its Japanese/European counterpart, but with scat vocals by Pastiche complementing the synths instead of an electric piano. Also similar to the Japanese/European soundtrack, the Good and Bad Future versions twist that sound into 2 radically different directions that border on a total genre shift, with the Good Future version turning it into pure synth rock, and the Bad Future going all in on the dramatic, atmospheric element of the American soundtrack. And last, but certainly not least, is Wacky Workbench, where the American soundtrack comes the closest to sounding like its Japanese contemporary. With its funky wah pedal guitar and the incorporation of ratchet spinning, metal clanging, and steam hissing to imitate active machinery, it's definitely going for a similar idea. The Bad Future version even uses these little synthesized beeps that kind of sound like the phone button samples from the Japanese soundtrack's Good Future. If you prefer the original music too, then I think you'll like these. But let's pivot away from Spencer Nilsen and David Young for just a bit, and focus on the other composer involved with Sonic CD's American soundtrack, Mark Sterling Crew. Because I want to talk about my definitive favorite part of the American soundtrack, which Mark Crew is responsible for creating, and that's the present version of Metallic Madness. Now, I absolutely adore the original Japanese theme for Metallic Madness, and it's an especially difficult track to replace for me. As soon as it starts, it comes out swinging at the listener with a flurry of orchestral hits and a wild piano line, before the garbled vocals, sirens, and whirring machinery kick in, which all give it a clear and immediate sense of danger that doesn't relent. However, with the American soundtrack, the present theme for Metallic Madness takes a much slower approach, building up tension for the final confrontation with Dr. Robotnik instead of being peril from the get-go. As the track progresses, more instruments are gradually introduced, and in particular, there's an electric guitar that's trying to add a heroic and hopeful character, similar to Stardust Speedway's Good Future, but it soon gets replaced by a series of low, droning synth chords and dour-sounding bells that point the music in a more ominous direction. It really emphasizes the idea that everything's on the line, and that either side could be victorious. Exactly what you'd want for the final level of a game like this. There's also a subtle but really clever detail going on with the instrumentation in Metallic Madness. If you were to listen closely to the full version of Metallic Madness Present, you might notice a set of bongos and conga drums being played by fellow Santana member Armando Peraza. They naturally stick out for being an acoustic instrument surrounded by so many electronic sounds, and since the early Sonic games frequently use industrial and synthesized motifs to represent Dr. Robotnik, I feel like the bongos and conga drums are meant to represent Sonic, as the hero trying to save Little Planet. If you've secured a good future from Metallic Madness, the music reflects this by making the bongos and conga drums the dominant percussion of the track, representing Sonic's ultimate victory over the Mad Doctor, as well as turning his evil lair into something more eco-friendly. But if the level's fate remains consigned to a bad future, the bongos and conga drums become nearly inaudible. They're drowned out by electronic percussion, as if to emphasize that Dr. Robotnik has won in the end, and the last remaining bit of hope for Little Planet is being snuffed out. See if you can hear what I mean. I also really like what Mark Crew did with Collision Chaos's Good and Bad Future tracks, which use a very similar grungy-sounding electric guitar, but surround it with different instruments that completely change its musical flavor. In the Good Future, it gets accented with twinkling piano notes and rising electronic glissandos that mimic the kind of noises you'd hear from a busy pinball machine, given that's what Collision Chaos is, while the Bad Future uses a slap bass, a waterphone-esque guitar wail, and duller-sounding bells that are played further apart. This gives it a much more ominous sound that better suits the broken-down scenery, and while you get that same sense of musical storytelling from every part of Sonic CD's American soundtrack, I feel like it's especially strong with Mark Crew's contributions. I mentioned this earlier, but Mark Crew was the one in charge of replacing the boss themes as well, Which gives me a wonderful segue to a specific reaction I kept seeing from people who grew up with the American soundtrack of Sonic CD. And that was how scary the game was, in all of its infinite fun. That's not entirely because of the boss theme, but it was by far the biggest culprit. The idea of Sonic CD being scary to one audience and not the other goes back to what I said at the beginning of this video, about how Sonic media made in the United States tends to take the source material into more dramatic and sometimes darker directions. Although the original Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic 2, and their 8-bit counterparts on the Game Gear and Master System all had levels set within Dr. Robotnik's bases of operations, like Scrap Brain Zone and Death Egg Zone, Sonic CD was the first game in the franchise to actually show what would happen if Dr. Robotnik did take over the world. Or a world, as the case may be. The bad future time periods of every zone in Sonic CD are not only highly mechanized and devoid of natural elements, they're also breaking down and are in a state of severe decay. They employ dingy and toxic color palettes, but how it all comes together depends on the music that completes the experience. The soundtrack in the Japanese/European release uses fast-paced music driven by Stadium House and acid influences that create a sense of panic, but it also gives you the impression that you can still go back and fix everything. The American soundtrack, on the other hand, hits the player with a much harder and blunter sense of hopelessness. It makes the existence of a bad future feel more like it's your fault, especially if you're seeing one as late as Stardust Speedway or Metallic Madness. At that point, you're either cutting things really close, or you've already let Dr. Robotnik win, no matter what the outcome of the final battle is. The one that really gets the strongest reaction out of me personally, though, is Tidal Tempest's Bad Future, which I briefly mentioned earlier. The setting of Tidal Tempest itself seems to be an ancient waterway of some kind, with signs of Dr. Robotnik working to transform it into something nefarious, which, should you time travel to the bad future, turns out to be a large sewer system or a chemical processing facility. And if you're playing with the American soundtrack, it sounds like you've wandered into some place that's off limits. Somewhere dangerous that you're not supposed to be in, and you know it. It's so tense and foreboding that it makes me shudder just about every time I hear it. And perhaps it's the similar aquatic/underwater setting, but I think this is where Spencer Nilsen's prior work with Echo the Dolphin is at its clearest. Just try not to think about what Sonic might be breathing in that purple gunk, because it sure isn't water anymore. Even the music for the special stages is kind of unsettling, which is such a tonal 180 from the original soundtrack, and it puts everything going on into a different perspective. What I mean by that is, if you're playing Sonic CD with the Japanese/European soundtrack, I don't think you'd feel particularly inclined to stop and wonder about what you're doing or where these places actually exist, because the music is constant high energy that makes you want to move. However, with the American soundtrack, the music sounds so serious and otherworldly. And it's only with the American version that I find myself pausing to think about the nature and significance of the special stages. These backdrops include odd details, like planets floating in the clouds, futuristic underwater cities, and an entire realm under a psychedelic rainbow sky, none of which look like the actual levels that Sonic goes through normally. Are these locations still on Little Planet, or are they some sort of pocket dimension created by the Time Stones? And if it's the latter, then how did Dr. Robotnik's UFOs get here in the first place? These are the kinds of questions that the American music puts in your mind, and I really like that unique gravitas it offers. Anyways, I got a little carried away there, so let's get back to the main fear factor that is the boss themes, because there actually is something unique about them that I want to mention, and that's the fact that we have a rare, confirmed musical influence for the American soundtrack. If you want to know why the American boss themes sound so creepy, Spencer Nilsen has mentioned that there was some possible inspiration drawn from the opening theme of the paranormal docuseries Unsolved Mysteries. Granted, as I've said before, these were tracks written by Mark Sterling Crew, but because I haven't found any interviews or personal comments about his work on Sonic CD, I'll just have to take Nilsen's word for it. And to his credit, you can definitely hear a similarity, so I believe that this is correct. Really, the only part of Sonic CD's American soundtrack that I don't like, and genuinely struggle to write about, despite my best efforts to find something positive, is the one level you haven't heard anything from, Quartz Quadrant. I don't know, maybe I'm just a little defensive because Quartz Quadrant is one of my favorite parts of the original Japanese soundtrack, especially because of its strong similarities to Italo house music, and that's something I can't just imagine being replaced. But I'm still going to try, because I want to mention every level's new music at least once. Alright, so the American version of Quartz Quadrant's present theme goes heavy on the soundtrack's rock-inspired aspects because, cave level, and it's definitely where you can hear the clearest influence from David Young and Spencer Nilsen's previous work with Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin. And that's perfectly fine on its own, even though it's also the single most okay song in the American soundtrack. No, my main issue is that the Good Future and Bad Future versions sound way too alike to my ears, likely due to time crunch. I do like the twinkling synths and glittery percussion that are clearly meant to evoke the image of the level's shining crystals, but you could honestly switch these two tracks around and I wouldn't be able to tell. Both could work for the Good Future's change of scenery, but it just does not work for the busy industrial hellscape of the Bad Future. I almost considered flipping the two titles and background footage just to prove my point, but I'm not going to do that to you. The audio speaks for itself. Now, I don't want to conclude our discussion on such a bitter, negative note, so I made sure to save one final highlight to bring up here at the end. If you've ever wondered what the American soundtrack might have sounded like if the deadline was just a little longer, then you'd be interested to know that Sega of America bundled a special album with certain pre-orders of Sonic the Hedgehog 3. Titled Sonic the Hedgehog Boom, it was the first time the soundtrack to a Sonic game had been released as a standalone album. And it didn't just include music ripped from the game. These were extended mixes that weren't able to be used in the initial release, though they would be added for the 2011 remaster of Sonic CD, the one spearheaded by the taxman himself, Christian Whitehead. By the way, I didn't have an opportunity to mention this during my video about the Japanese/European soundtrack, but that one got a similar album of its own, titled Sonic the Hedgehog Remix. As the name suggests, it's not the original soundtrack, but rather a fantastic collection of official remixes by Naofumi Hataya and Masafumi Ogata, including 2 possible, but currently unconfirmed, fragments of what could have been the good and bad future versions of the infamous removed level Dubious Depths, also known as Ridicule Root or simply R2. The present version, however, is still in the final game, having been repurposed as the default music for the DA Garden. That's how we can make those musical comparisons. And yeah, this isn't about the American soundtrack, but I don't know when else I'd get to bring this up, so look at it this way. Both soundtracks received a special album after release, with tracks that were officially implemented in the 2011 remaster of Sonic CD, and I think that's really cool. You're still getting the soundbites for Dubious Depths, though. I need to get it out of my system, and I already missed the first opportunity, so I'm not gonna let it slip past me again. And with that, we've pretty much covered everything I wanted to touch on with the American soundtrack, plus a little bonus for the Japanese/European soundtrack here at the end. So even though this was a shorter discussion than the other video, I think it's time to bring this whole musical adventure together with a proper conclusion. Let's put this years-long endeavor to rest, shall we? As I've mentioned before, Sonic CD is one of the rare instances where I feel comfortable and confident calling it one of my favorite games of all time, and that my opinion of it isn't changing anytime in the near future. I've been deeply fascinated by this game and the story of its creation ever since I first came across it in 2011, and both sides of the music have been an especially important factor in that. If you had asked me to talk about the American soundtrack of Sonic CD a few years ago, I probably would have said some pretty harsh and dismissive things about it. But that's because I was choosing to remain ignorant back then instead of keeping an open mind. And I'm glad I finally had that turnaround moment, even if it took its sweet time to happen. Because despite their differences in vision and intent, both soundtracks were made with a similar sense of passion and dedication, and I'm happy to have given each one its appropriate time in the spotlight. While the Japanese/European soundtrack of Sonic CD was driven by Sega wanting to show off what CD quality audio could add to their games, as well as continuing the idea of Sonic games having catchy, trendy music, the American soundtrack was made to go hand in hand with the game's existing elements of environmental storytelling. And when it hits that immersive, atmospheric sound, it brings out an entirely different experience that I highly encourage everyone to go through at least once. If you haven't done so already, of course. I'm especially curious to hear from people who grew up with the American soundtrack and/or prefer it over the Japanese/European soundtrack. For those of you watching, how did I do? Was I able to adequately explain why people should give it a chance? And for that matter, did it sound weird to hear all of that from someone who still prefers the original soundtrack? In any case, whether you've watched both videos on the dual soundtracks of Sonic CD, or you just focused on this one, I want to thank you so much for watching all the way through. It's been a wild ride finally putting these together after many years of hesitation, and one that I feel especially accomplished to be through with. In case you haven't seen the first video on the Japanese/European soundtrack, or the video that inspired it, and this one by extension, I've included links to both down in the description. And until next time, if you ever feel hesitant about embarking on a big creative enterprise, just remember that it's alright. Take a chance, because there is no circumstance that you can't handle when you use your mind.